Okay, shalom banim. Hashiur shalanu hi b'tzimchonut. The topic is vegetarianism. Hashela hi mahi hashkafat haTorah b'inyan hatzimchonut. So we have a bunch of sources that we can look at, and we're going to look at several. B'Sefer Bereshit Katuv, right in front of you, source number one. Pasuk Chaf Tet, Vayomer Elokim, Hine natati lachem et kol esev zorei zera, asher al pnei kol haaretz. Hashem says, I will give you, or I give you all of the vegetation of the earth, that kol eitz asher bo pri eitz zorei zara lachem yalachla, and all the trees, the fruits of the trees, for you to eat. אז רואים מהפסוקים האלה, מהפסוק הזה, שלפני המבול, before the flood, השם נתן את בני אדם לאכול את הירק השדה. So vegetarianism was the way of the world. וכנראה שבעולם האידיאל, בעולם לכתחילה, in the best version of the world, which is the world that Hashem created, vegetarianism was the way to go. As לפי הפסוק, זה מה שמשמע. עכשיו, אם מסתכלים במקור מספר 2, בראשית פרק ט', כתוב, ויברך אלוהים את נוח, it's right in front of you, ויברך אלוהים את נוח, right where my cursor is, right over here. ויברך אלוקים את נוח ואת בניו, ויאמר להם, פורו מילאו את הארץ. Now Noach is starting over the world again after the flood. And take a look at Pasuk Gimel. Kol remes asher hu chai lachem yihya le'ochla, ki yerek esev natati lachem et kol. Hashem says that now, after the flood, I give you kol remes asher hu chai lachem yalachla, which means all the living things, all the animals, all the non-plant life. That I'm going to give you now. Lachem yalachla ki yerek esev natati lachem et hakol. Just like the vegetation that I gave you, I'm giving you everything. So, as nireh מהפסוקים בספר בראשית, שלכתחילה בני אדם רק אכלו ירק השדה, עשב השדה, פרי עץ, etc. ולבסוף, לאחר המבול, היה היתר אכילת בשר. Now, if you look at the Malbim, source number 3, the Malbim explains that these two psukim are not just accidental, but they teach us an important lesson. The pasuk earlier in Breshit Aleph, and then before the flood, and the pasuk later in Breshit Tet after the flood. And let's take a look at what the Malbim says, right here by my cursor. Kol remes asher hu chai lachem yelachla katuv b'pasuk שבני אדם יכולים עכשיו לאכול דבר חי, non-plant life. כי בימי אדם היו גופות בני אדם חזקים. What counts for this change? Says the Malbim, this is not an accidental change. This is intentional. And the reason for this change is, בימי אדם, earlier, when the times of Adam, people were strong, physically strong. והפירות לא נשחטו עדיין, and the nutritious value and life-giving value of the plant life had not yet disintegrated. והיו מכלכלים את בני אדם כמו הבשר. לפני המבול, before the flood, the vegetation, the plant life, had the capacity to provide everything that was necessary for human beings to live. Aval, however, says the Malbim, achar hamabul shinit kalkalu hamizonot, after the Mabul, that the sustenance of the world became corrupt. In other words, the vegetation no longer had the same energy and power to sustain life that it did beforehand. V'hadam huchan she'itpashet b'kitzvei haaretz v'iyim rechokim, And that fact, coupled with the fact that human beings are now going to, go to the far off corners of the globe where the climate is very challenging. שמאז נעשה קור וחום וצריך לבשר להעמדת בריאותו. So in these challenging climates, Gan Eden, you didn't have a challenging climate. It was the perfect climate to sustain life. Aval, b'kitzvei eretz v'yimer chokim, in the ends of the earth and the faraway isles, so it's cold and it's hot and the climate changes. V'tzarich lebasar, and the human flesh, the human being, requires greater fortitude, greater strength, greater nutritious items to consume that will strengthen his body for the purposes of good health. So this is what the Malbim says. Hamalbim omer shelifnei hamabul hatzimchonut, the vegetarian properties of life were sufficient l'kayem et adam. Aval achar hamabul, two things happen. Number one is that the human being required more to sustain themselves, and the plant life was less capable, was corrupted. So if before the Mabul, plant life was strong and the human beings didn't require as much, and after the Mabul, plant life was weakened and human beings required greater fortitude, greater sustenance. V'lachen omer hamalbim, it's like a very practical kind of thing. This isn't a moral question, but it's a practical thing. Hashem hitir achilat basar achar mabul kidei lekayem et bnei adam, for practical reasons, so people could live better. Now, if you scroll down here by my cursor, you'll see right over here, Amar Rav Yehuda Masechet Sanhedrin. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav, the Gemara says, Adam Rishon lo hutar lo basar la'achila. Adam Rishon, Hashem lo hitir, did not permit Adam Rishon lechol basar. Dichtiv, k'mo shekatuv b'Torah, and we saw this pasuk on the top of our page, lachem yeh l'chla l'chol chayat ha'aretz, that the vegetation of the world is what is going to sustain human beings and animal life. V'lo chayat ha'aretz lachem, aval chayot, animal life is not for you to consume before the flood. So says the Gemara. So what is the purpose? Ukishebau b'nei Noach hitir lahem shenemar ki yerek esav natati lachem et kol. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says Hashem did not permit initially and permitted afterwards. So this language of the Gemara in Sanhedrin sounds more like some type of legal or moral judgment here. According to the Malbim, it was just a question of practicality. What kind of food will sustain the people well? The Gemara in Sanhedrin uses the language of mutar versus or asur, something which is permitted or not permitted. So if something is permitted by Hashem, that gives it moral value. If something is prohibited by Hashem, that is morally that assumes that it is morally wrong. Hashem determines what is right and wrong, good and bad in the world. So we have two different views here, or two different perspectives as to the idea of the permissibility of eating meat. Number one, Malbim, it's just a practical thing. And number two, Sanhedrin, it sounds like there's some type of ethical or moral judgment that is being made. Okay, and finally, in this brief unit, we're going to take a look at Divrei Harav Kook, the words of Rav Kook as recorded and transmitted by Rabbi J. David Bleich, page 44 in your Choveret. So right in front of you. And we'll do one at a time. Rav Kook makes four distinct arguments here as a critique of vegetarianism as a goal that we must all aspire to or live by. So here are the four things. I'm going to quote to you the key line in each paragraph here. Number one, in effect, the argument is that there ought to be a proper ordering of priorities. Rav Kook is explicit in stating that enmity between nations and racial discrimination should be of greater moral concern to mankind than the well-being of animals, and that only when such matters have rectified should attention be turned to the question of animal welfare. Meaning that it's a question of ordering your priorities. Seder hadevarim. So first you have to deal with the more important value, which is human beings getting along and taking care of one another. And only then should one then proceed to the next level, which is honoring the life of non-humans, of animals. Okay. Number two. Again, let me quote for you the key line here. It says, in the middle of a paragraph by my cursor here, Rav Kook argues that if man assumes the moral of not eating meat, man will violate this norm in seeking self-gratification. Once taking the life of animals is regarded as being equal in abhorrence to taking the life of man, it will transpire that in the pursuit of meat, man will regard cannibalism as no more heinous than the consumption of the flesh of the animals. The result will be not enhanced respect for life of animals, but rather debasement of human life. Meaning that if we all assume the moral of eating meat, of not eating meat, it's likely that human beings are human beings and people are going to fail. So people are going to end up, eating meat anyway. So now that we're living in a society where we treat human life equal to animal life, and I ended up, doing quote unquote an avera and eating meat. So in my mind, what did I do? I did the equivalent of eating a human being, because animals and human beings in this moral world are going to be equal. So if I make a mistake and I fail in this moral and I end up eating meat, so in my mind I've just crossed a moral barrier, and now there's no stopping me from cannibalism, because if I eat meat and of animals, and animals are equal to humans, so there's nothing really stopping me from eating a human being. So he says this will not lead to greater sensitivity to animals. This type of thing will ultimately lead to greater insensitivity to human beings. Number three, says Rav Kook, man was granted the ability to rule over animals, including to take their life, in order that human beings should realize that we are spiritually superior and have more moral obligations than animals do. Now, if we give animals the same rights and as human beings, what happens, again, another way Rav Kook is sort of, I think, making a similar point, if we look at them as with the same sensitivity, we are not going to ending up treating animals better. We're actually going to end up treating human beings worse, because we are going to see ourselves not as above animals, but we will see ourselves as equal to animals. And once we see ourselves as equal to animals, we're going to behave like animals. And in his final point, Rav Kook makes here, is that if vegetarianism, again by my cursor over here, if vegetarianism were to become the norm that people do in daily life, it could very well happen that people will become callous and insensitive to human welfare, because it's the natural instinct of human beings to try to live a moral life. So what will happen is people will exaggerate their concern for animals and animal welfare as a natural instinct of the human being to be very moral, but will do so in an exaggerated way, and thus, once again, human beings will suffer. For example, let's say people are concerned about the climate and the environment and the future of civilization. So these are valid things to be concerned about, but sometimes what happens is people put all their moral energies into a cause at the expense of everything and everyone else. And this is what Rav Kook was concerned about. People putting their energies into animal welfare and as part of the human desire to be moral, but being human beings doing so at the expense of people. Rabbi Bleich concludes that Rav Kook does not necessarily critique vegetarianism as a whole, as individuals who want to do it for whatever reasons, but not as a moral standard for all of society.